Welcome to the next to last week of our series here on difficult passages, toughest passages in the Old Testament. Next week, it's a communion Sunday, so we won't be having the class. But then the following Sunday, the first Sunday in November, we'll be concluding this series as I'm going to be looking at genocide in the Bible, classic genocide passages. So keep your mind open for that. So we began this series weeks ago where we asked the question, is the God of the Old Testament the same God as the New Testament? And then we looked at, what was this with God hardening Pharaoh's heart? What was that all about? Week 3 was, well, how could God love Jacob and hate Esau? Poor Esau. Why would God ever do that to him? Did the guy never have a chance? Last week we discussed polygamy in the Bible. Does God seem to endorse polygamy? And if he doesn't, why did he let it happen? We addressed all that stuff. Today, we're talking about what about the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, and slavery. At the end, if we have time, I may touch very briefly on New Testament slavery. But it's a lot different in the New Testament because it was slavery in a culture that was not a biblical culture per se. But in the Old Testament, God seems to have case law and so on factoring in slavery. So we treat this one a bit differently. Critics will often point out that there are verses in the Bible that speak about slavery without condemning it, and in some cases actually seem to endorse it. In the Old Testament, there are rules laid out for when you wanted to buy a Hebrew slave, or if a father who wanted to sell his daughter. What's up with that? Okay, so what's going on here? In the very limited time we have today, let me do my best to answer these questions. Now, what did we learn earlier in this series? Let's remind ourselves. In a recent sermon series as well that we did called How Not to Read the Bible, as well as week 1 in this Bible study, we learned that the Bible was written in ancient cultures, by ancient writers, to ancient cultures, about ancient issues. So we learned that to properly interpret ancient documents, you need to read the words as they were understood and used in their original context, not as they are understood and used today. That's crucial. It's called exegesis. It's called hermeneutics, the science of hermeneutics, translating, interpreting an ancient text. Now, the common mistake that many people make is when it comes to the Bible and slavery. And that is assuming that the word slavery, as it's used in the Bible, is describing the same thing as when the word is used today. Okay? That is a false assumption. And it's known as the fallacy of equivocation. This is a really fancy term that you're going to look really smart tomorrow at work. And that's I think you've committed the fallacy of equivocation there, boss. You can throw that out. What's the fallacy of equivocation? Well, it says on your outline. The logical fallacy of equivocation is committed when the same word or phrase is used in different senses within an argument, making reasoning misleading. So the fallacy of equivocation is when the same word or phrase is used in different senses within this one argument, making reasoning misleading. For example, a guy pulls up and he sees a sign on the road, and the sign says, "Fine for parking here." So he said, well, since it's fine, I'll park here. It says fine for parking here. That's the fallacy of equivocation. That's taking the same word, fine, and thinking it means giving it two different meanings, okay? Fine for parking here, well, that means you will get a fine if you park here. It doesn't mean it's fine, it's good to park here. Same word, different meanings. Well, it's similar when we talk about slavery, using the word slavery in the Old Testament and when we use it today. This fallacy typically takes place when someone says there's slavery in the Bible. When they say slavery, they don't mean slavery like it's meant in the Old Testament. When someone today makes that assertion, they're usually applying the concept to antebellum slavery. Antebellum slavery. Antebellum slavery, that's from the ante is Latin for before, and bellum is Latin for war. So antebellum, when you hear about the antebellum South or antebellum slavery, they're talking about the slavery that existed before the Civil War. That was 1861 to 65, I think, was the Civil War in the States. So antebellum slavery is slavery that existed before the Civil War in the American South. And when people say, well, there's slavery in the Old Testament, they're thinking antebellum slavery, okay? But that is very different than how the word slavery is used and what it's describing in the Old Testament. It's not identical. And on your outline, I believe we do a bit of a contrast here. So what's antebellum slavery? This isn't on your outline, but essentially antebellum slavery, it was race-based slavery, okay? It was, an antebellum slave had no rights whatsoever. And the owner, the master of an antebellum slave, could do whatever they wanted to that slave. They could harm them, they could kill them if they want, strictly speaking. That's very different than slavery as it's referred in the Old Testament, which is indentured servitude. Indentured servitude is what Old Testament slavery is. Indentured servitude. Well, what's indentured servitude? That is a servant with false teeth. I'm kidding. That's not what it means. What do we talk about when we talk about indentured servitude? Think in these terms, and this isn't the blanks yet. I'll let you know when it's time for the blanks. If an ancient Israelite had no money, or they had gone into serious debt, they had the option of becoming an indentured servant, okay? Or we call them, and it's referred to by some translations, and we'll get into that. Some scholars are very frustrated with modern translators using the word slave, but we'll explain that in a moment. You had the choice of, okay, I'm in serious debt, I've got no money, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to enter into a contract of indentured servitude or slave as a way of earning a living and paying off my debt. Okay, it wasn't a wonderful option, nor was it an ideal practice. However, in ancient cultures with limited economies, it was better than starving or being jailed or being killed. And it was allowed as an option in the Old Testament, and there were laws created to prevent its abuse. So, in the Old Testament, in ancient Israelite culture, there were three stages, three options, if you will, for battling poverty, according to Leviticus 25, and we'll look at these in a moment. Stage one, as your outline says, a poor Israelite mortgages his land until the year of Jubilee. So your first option was you could mortgage your land until the year of Jubilee. Let's look at Leviticus 25, starting at verse 25. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they've sold. So in other words, your relative, keep in mind, Israel is divided up according to clans and tribes, right? Clans and tribes had certain land all over the nation. And so your relative could come and redeem the land, buy your property from you, keep it in the family would be the ideal, okay? That's what this is saying. If, however, there's no one to redeem it for them, but later on they prosper and acquire sufficient means to redeem it themselves, they are to determine the value for the years since they sold it and refund the balance to the one to whom they sold it. They can then go back to their own property. But if they don't acquire the means to repay, what was sold will remain in the possession of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. It will be returned in the Jubilee, and they can then go back to their property. What was the year of Jubilee? Every 50 years, actually, Israel went in a cycle of 7 years, up to 50 years. Every 7th year was a sabbatical year, and then every 50th year was a year of Jubilee. And in the year of Jubilee, any land that had been sold or transferred during those previous 49 years was to be returned to the original owners. No questions asked. Okay? So whatever land had been sold and how many times that land property had been flipped over those 49 years didn't matter. 50th year, it goes back to the original owners at the very beginning. So the cost per acre of land would be higher the farther away from the year of Jubilee. Because when you purchased it, the term of use would be longer. So if you buy land 1 year before the year of Jubilee, it's not going to cost you much because you only get it for a year. But if you buy it the year after the year of Jubilee, you can have it conceivably for the next 49 years. That's going to cost you more. So you're basically leasing the land as opposed to buying it. That's why Leviticus 25:14-16 talks about this and lays out that, the cost of land has to be proportional according to the year of Jubilee, is what Leviticus says. Okay? All debts, so all land would be returned to the year of Jubilee. All debts were to be canceled. So the closer to the year of Jubilee that you got a loan, the stricter the rules would be, the higher the level of collateral would be required, because the lending risk was huge. If I lend you a bunch of money the year before Jubilee, I mean, you've only got 1 year and your debt's going to be canceled. So probably it wasn't a lot of lending going on the closer you got to Jubilee, likely. And also in the year of Jubilee, all Hebrew slaves would be set free. Okay? All this, the year of Jubilee, was instituted as a way of preventing long-term inequality in the society, as a way of restoring ancient or ancestral property, as a way of protecting families from permanent poverty. It reinforced God's ownership of the land and his ownership of the people, and it emphasized social justice, mercy, and restoration. Okay, so stage one, when you get in debt, a poor Israelite could mortgage his land until the year of Jubilee. Stage two, as your outline says, if that didn't pay his debt, he can seek to access an interest-free loan. He can access an interest-free loan, which was theoretically every loan in Israel. If you were an Israelite, you were not allowed to charge interest to another Israelite. You could charge interest to a foreigner, but not to a fellow Israelite. Leviticus 25, verse 35-38. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and stranger, so they can continue to live among you. Don't take interest or any profit from them, but fear your God, so that they may continue to live among you. You must not lend them money at interest or sell them food at a profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan to be your God. Okay, so the land didn't work, so what you could do is go out and get a loan, okay, an interest-free loan. Stage three, if the loan fails to resolve the debt, he and possibly his entire family can work for a fellow Israelite as a contracted employee. As a contracted employee, eventually returning to normal life once the debt is resolved. We pick that up in verse 39 of Leviticus 25. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. This sounds a little confusing. We'll straighten this out in a minute. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. In your version, underline the word slaves in verse 39, and then also underline the word work for you in verse 40. We'll get back to this in a moment. This is where it's a little confusing. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors. Because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. They must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Okay? Now, this is where we come up against the tension in the Hebrew translations. That word slaves in verse 39 and the phrase work for you in verse 40, grammatically, it's the same word. It's the Hebrew word, and rooted from the Hebrew word abed. Abed, okay? Which is it's a noun, abed, which means it's translated sometimes slave, but it's often translated as worker or servant. Okay? Abed. And so that's what's the word in verse 39. In verse 40, it's translated as worker. In verse 39, it's translated as slave. And this is where it's a little confusing and frustrating for lots of modern translators. Because for many modern day scholars, the use of the word slave carries with it all kinds of baggage in the 21st century. And this is where the fallacy of equivocation takes place, because by using the word slave, people are thinking, oh, antebellum slavery. But no, that's not what it means here, necessarily, okay? So, as your outline says, the Hebrew word Abed, slave, in many modern translations, is better translated servant or worker, if one wishes to avoid this fallacy of equivocation. In ancient Hebrew, Abed simply refers to someone who is in a dynamic dependency relationship. Dynamic dependency relationship. That's what Abed refers to. Someone in a dynamic dependency relationship. For example, Exodus 14:31, Moses is God's Abed. Moses is the Abed of God in Exodus 14:31. 2 Samuel 7, verses 5 to 8, David is God's Abed. He's the Abed of God. Okay? Isaiah 42:1, the Messiah is God's Abed. Okay? Exodus 21:2-6, men and women can be the Abed of one another. Okay? So it's a word for a dynamic dependency relationship. Moses had this dependency upon God. King David had this dependency. He was a worker, a servant, a slave, if you will, of God. He looked to God as his source. The Messiah was the servant of the Lord in Isaiah. It's the Abed of the Lord. That's the word used here. And so it could be translated slave, but you have to understand the context, what it means, okay? As your outline says, letter B, indentured servitude was a contractual arrangement, not an entrapped bondage. It was a contractual arrangement. It was not an entrapped bondage. We need to understand the difference here. Let's read Deuteronomy 15, verses 12 to 18. It says, if any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, in the 7th year you must let them go free. And when you release them, don't send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That's why I give you this command today. But if your servant says to you, I don't want to leave you, because he loves you and your family and is well off with you, then take an awl and push it through his earlobe into the door, and he'll become your servant for life. Do the same for your female servant. Do not consider it a hardship or set your servant free, because their service to you these 6 years has been worth twice as much as that of a hired hand. And the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do. So, servants, in this context, was a 6-year contract. 6 years, and then the 7th year, they would be set free. So again, this is not antebellum slavery. Okay, this is it's a dynamic dependency relationship. It's a contractual arrangement. It's not entrapped bondage. Exodus 21, verse 2. Exodus 21, verse 2. Where we read, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. Okay? Leviticus 25, verses 39 to 41. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, we've already read this one, don't make them work as slaves, as abed, okay? They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. So when you bought a Hebrew abed or slave or servant, you were acquiring their labor contract. You were not acquiring them as a person. Okay? This wasn't chattel slavery. Okay? Like antebellum slavery. They weren't property. Now that's when we're talking about Israelites with other Israelites. We're going to see a bit of a distinction when it comes to foreigners in a moment. Okay? Now, as your outline says, so this type of slavery, abed indentured servitude, is what we're talking about here. Old Testament slavery is indentured servitude. It's contractual. As your outline says, it was voluntary, not coerced. It was voluntary. It was not coerced. Secondly, it was enforced by a contract, not by chains. It was enforced by a contract, not enforced by chains. And thirdly, it had a fixed 6-year term limit. It had a fixed 6-year term limit. And as we just read, upon release, the master or the employer was to provide generously from his flock and harvest so the freed servant could restart their life. Okay? This is very different than antebellum slavery. You can see why it's a fallacy of equivocation. Using the same word, you're describing two completely different things here. As your outline says, number 4, in a limited options economy, it was a way of avoiding starvation or paying off debt. It was a way to avoid starvation. It was a way of paying off debt. Okay, I don't have any money to give you. I will sell myself to you. I will contract myself to you. And what it was I will come live in your home. You will pay me room and board for my services, and maybe you'll pay me a salary on top of this. But I'm committing myself to work in your home for 6 years to pay off this debt that I owe to you. Okay? And you could recontract up again if you wanted after that. And as we just read a moment ago, some servants would say, listen, keep in mind, it's not as though this was this booming economy. It's like, listen, I've got it pretty good being your abed, your servant. You pay me room, you pay me board, you take care of me. I have food, I have a place, my family is secure here. I want to be your abed for life. I want this to be my career. You could do that if you chose to do that. And you would show that by, having an earring thing right here as a sign. Just like a ring is a sign of a contract between a husband and a wife. This was a sign that you have contracted yourself for life to this employer. Okay? So it's not as though you're being whipped and beaten. No, it was a job. It was a way of having safety and economic security at that time. And a way of paying off debt as well. So as I stated earlier, in the Bible, the terms buy and sell, owner and master, were certainly used. But these terms did not necessarily imply that the slave or servant was mere property or chattel. Okay? Even today, we use similar terms and we don't think of them as dehumanizing. We do it all the time. Every day we read about some professional athlete being bought by an owner or traded from one owner to another owner. And when we hear that, do we feel sorry for those professional athletes? I doubt it. Why not? Because we understand that these terms are being used in our culture, in our context. And in a similar way, when it comes to how the words were used in the Bible, it's very similar. Letter C on your outline, the next blank. Kidnapping, which was the foundation of antebellum slavery, enforced, was prohibited in Israel. It was prohibited. It was not allowed. Exodus 21:16. He who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or he is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. Deuteronomy 24:7. If a man is caught kidnapping any of his countrymen of the sons of Israel, and he deals with him violently or sells him, then that thief shall die. So you shall purge this evil from among you. You could not kidnap somebody and then force them to be your abed, your slave, your servant. You couldn't do that. Against the law, it would mean your death. Very different than antebellum slavery. As well, letter D. Harsh treatment of indentured servants was forbidden. To treat your indentured servant, your abed, harshly was forbidden. Exodus 21:26-27. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. An owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. Okay, and that's not just, okay, well, I just The arm was broken, so at least it wasn't an eye or a tooth. No, it's not. These are principles that are being laid out, case law that's being laid out. If you harm that servant, then that servant can go free, is what they're saying. Harsh treatment of indentured servants, completely forbidden. Letter E, foreign runaway slaves who fled to Israel to seek refuge were protected. So someone from Jordan, someone from Syria, from Lebanon, from Egypt, they were in this type of slavery. Like the nations around did not have these similar laws. And so they actually escaped from harsh slavery, and they escaped into Israel. In the nations around, they had contracts. They had, what type of, we call them today, we have agreements like, what is it, if one country wants to, we have an understanding that you'll send your bad guys to me or my bad guys. Extradition treaties. The other nations around had extradition treaties with one another. Israel did not sign off on those, meaning if a foreign slave ran into Israel, Israel would not return them. They would be safe and protected in Israel. Deuteronomy 23, 15 to 16. Let me read that. 23, 15 to 16. If a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you wherever they like and in whatever town they choose. Do not oppress them. This is very different. Okay? Very different. Now that's for Israelites and even for foreign slaves if they escaped into Israel. However, it's not all that rosy and not all. If we stop there, we'd say, oh, this is great, complete misrepresentation. There's more, though. The most challenging passage regarding slavery in the Old Testament is found in Leviticus 25, verse 42 to 51, which we'll read in a moment. This describes the unique condition of servants or slaves that are not Israelites. Okay, let's read it. Leviticus 25, starting at verse 42. Because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. If a foreigner residing among you becomes rich, and any of your, and here's where there's nuance though. Because right now, what we just read that, and you're thinking, oh, that sounds like antebellum, but keep reading. If a foreigner residing among you becomes rich, and any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to the foreigner, or to a member of the foreigner's clan, they retain the right of redemption after they have sold themselves. One of their relatives may redeem them. An uncle or a cousin or any blood relative in their clan may redeem them. So you can say, what's going on here? So here's where it's a little more nuanced. When Moses speaks of, as your outline says, of not making other Israelites work as slaves, the context of this chapter appears to be alluding to the length of the service as opposed to the nature of the work. The context seems to be speaking of the length of service, not the nature of the work. Because we've already seen that Israelites can be abed. They can be servants and slaves to other Israelites. But you can't have them be an abed for life. You have to let them every 7 years, on the 7th year, and at the year of Jubilee. By the way, the best I understand this, so as I said earlier, you'd have 6 years, and then on the 7th year would be a sabbatical year. And then you'd have 6 more years, and then 7th would be sabbatical. And you had those cycles until the 50th year, which would be the Jubilee. And I was a little confused studying this. I thought, so how does that work? So if I sell myself, I contractually obligate myself to you for 6 years. But what if I do that on the 5th year of the first 6-year cycle? I've only got 1 year till the sabbatical year, the year when debts are canceled to a degree, and slaves are freed to a degree, it seems. So what is this? And the best I could understand is, here's how it worked. Is, okay, so I contract myself on the 5th year. Okay, so I've got 1 more year and then the sabbatical year. Does that mean I only have to work for 1 year as a slave and then I'm free? No. What it means is I work for you for 6 years, including the Sabbath year. But my Sabbath year is like a statutory holiday. So I'm your servant, and I'm living in your home and so on, but the fields are not to be tilled or anything, and the land, it's a year of Sabbath for the land, for everyone. So this is like a really easy year. But I'm still your Ebed for another 5 years into the next term. See how that works? But if it's Jubilee, no, I am completely free. And I have no more obligation to you. Okay, that's the difference between the Sabbath years and the year of Jubilee. Year of Jubilee was a Sabbath on steroids. Okay, if you can think in those terms. Now, unlike an Israelite, it was possible for a foreign-born servant to be a servant or slave for life. They were not included in the year of Jubilee legislation either. So year of Jubilee did not free foreign-born slaves. As your outline says, Israelites are not encouraged to acquire foreign servants. They're only permitted to do so. So they weren't encouraged to do it. They were simply permitted to do so. Foreigners appear to have been treated legally as property. However, they were not to be dehumanized. So they were legally treated as property, but they were not to be dehumanized. So it wasn't antebellum slavery, but neither was it full indentured servitude slavery. Indentured servitude was reserved for Israelites. This form of slavery for foreigners was they were your property, but you didn't let them go. They could be your property for life. However, Israel's understanding of God's image in every human being from Genesis, plus Israel's own history of Egyptian bondage, was to act as a shield against abuse. God would continually say, remember, you were slaves in Egypt. And so we're going to read in a moment that the Old Testament is filled with times where God says, be kind to the alien, be kind to the stranger. You were aliens, you were strangers. As your outline says, letter C, since foreigners had no property rights in Israel, you couldn't buy land in Israel. I think it's still the same today. In fact, nobody really owns the land in Israel. The government owns all the land, essentially, in Israel. You kind of lease it. But since foreigners had no property rights in Israel, their financial options were limited to attaching themselves to an Israelite household to receive money, security, food, clothing, and shelter. So since foreigners had no property rights, you couldn't own land in Israel. Those were reserved for the clans and families. Your financial options were limited to attaching themselves to an Israelite household as a way of receiving money, security, food, clothing, and shelter. However, letter D, as we already read, foreigners had the right and the ability to own their own businesses and prosper, even to the point of having Israelites work as servants for them. We read that in Leviticus 25, 47, 48. So if you're a foreigner, you couldn't own land, but you could own a business, you could prosper, and you could have Israelite servants and slaves. Okay? Your outline says, letter E, 36 times the Israelites are told to be kind to aliens. 36 times. Since Israelites were once aliens in Egypt. If a slave was being treated harshly, they had the option to run away and seek refuge without the fear or threat of being forcibly returned to the harsh conditions. So if you're getting treated poorly, you could run away and you would not be returned to your harsh taskmaster. So here's the bottom line. Slavery was a product of broken humanity in a broken society. And sometimes God deals with our brokenness by limiting the damage that we can do to one another. We learned that in week 1 of this series. That's what he did with marriage, remember. God's ideal, his design for marriage is one man, one woman in a lifelong relationship. But Jesus said, due to the hardness of our hearts, Moses permitted divorce. Because we live in a world where there's relational breakdown. Okay? As a result, as a concession, God allows for divorce as a way of limiting the damage that our brokenness can do to each other. So as your outline says, slavery or indentured servitude was similar to divorce. It was not God's desire, nor was it God's design. It wasn't God's desire, nor was it God's design. It was a practical concession. That's the next blank. It was a practical concession to the reality of broken, sinful humanity. And the last blanks. God created laws to limit its damage, not to promote its use. God created laws to limit its damage, not to promote its use. Simply stated, slavery in the Bible is not what is depicted by the modern critic. God is not pro-slavery. In fact, the entire biblical record is the story of God going to extreme lengths to deliver humanity from all bondage. Every form of slavery, slavery to sin, slavery to fear, slavery to addiction, slavery to debt. Next time we're together, genocide and Canaan and all that stuff. That's next time, the first Sunday in November.